Hello, I'm Tom Leach, and I'm here, or not quite here, to talk about the value of teaching media literacy through fiction. I'm strongly prejudiced in favor of the benefits of teaching the humanities generally, but my focus today isn't on the widely noted ability of the humanities to encourage empathy and independent thinking, but on a much more specific, practical, and neglected application of the ability it nurtures to read fictional narratives intelligently. In brief, I think most people read fictional stories much more critically than they read news stories. And I'd suggest that the habits and skills we teach students of fiction could profitably be applied to their reading and watching and listening to the news. Everyone agrees that the dramatic proliferation of online, uncurated, biased, inaccurate, and malicious news stories these days has made media literacy a more important skill than ever for readers to cultivate. The most common response to our contemporary crisis in media illiteracy has been to encourage readers to filter the news sources they trust more discriminatingly. A representative recent initiative is NewsGuard, a site whose cover page boasts that its trust ratings for online news sites are produced by humans, not AI. NewsGuard's expert human reviewers rate news sites green, generally trustworthy, or red, generally not trustworthy, on the basis of a trust score ranging from 0 to 100 points. 5 of NewsGuard's rating criteria, accounting for 75 points, concern credibility, whether the site routinely avoids false content, presents information responsibly, regularly corrects or clarifies errors, clearly distinguishes news from opinion, and avoids deceptive or misleading headlines. 4 more criteria, accounting for 25 points, concern transparency, whether the site discloses its ownership and financing, clearly labels its advertising as such, identifies its managers and their possible conflicts of interest, and provides names and other identifying information about content creators. NewsGuard is a laudable endeavor, and I'd love to see its criteria more widely embraced. Even putting aside the question of whether its team of journalists and experienced editors are capable of rating news sites as objectively as its 100-point scale implies, however, it ducks the biggest problem in reading the news by focusing on the differences among the ways the news is produced rather than the different ways it's read. Its rating system reminds me of the days when high school teachers assured their students that they could trust content on sites labeled .gov and .edu, but not sites labeled .net and .com. There's certainly something to this advice, but by shifting the responsibility from establishing trustworthiness from content users to content providers, it implies that users' sole responsibility is to find a site with the right suffix, or as NewsGuard would say, a 100% green rating, and then trust it unconditionally. That may indeed be the way many of us proceed when we read the news, but it's a dismayingly irresponsible way to proceed. And I'm convinced we'd do much better if we called on some of the skills we learned to use in the reading of fiction. The ratings NewsGuard applies to online news sources are based on a relatively narrow series of questions. Does this site avoid false content? Are its stories credibly sourced? Are they balanced and unbiased? Does it tell you who's creating and moderating its content and disclosing their possible prejudices and conflicts of interest? In essence, most of these questions boil down to a single question. Are the stories on this site accurate, biased, deceptive, or just plain untrue? That's a really important question, but it's only one question. Consider the much wider array of questions we typically ask of fictional stories from the Iliad to Harry Potter, whose factual accuracy we never question because we know they're made up. What is the conflict that drives the plot of this story, and what's at stake in this conflict? Who are the principal parties to this conflict? Who are the good guys and the bad guys, and how can we tell? What's going to happen next, and where's this all heading? Which apparently marginal tangents and details are most likely to turn out to be significant, and what exactly is their significance? In short, what does this story mean? If the questions most often asked of news stories involve the accuracy of specific stories or statements, or the trustworthiness of specific news stories, readers of fiction waive these questions to focus on the implications of the story's propositions rather than the propositions themselves. Sometimes these questions are shaped by generic expectations. Seasoned fans of detective fiction, for instance, mine every description and every line of dialogue for clues that will allow them to determine who killed Roger Ackroyd before the big reveal. Readers of historical fiction routinely ask, what's this story telling me about the period when it's set? Readers of science fiction so often speculate, is this really likely to happen? That a more recent name conferred on the genre is speculative fiction. But many questions readers ask float free of generic norms and expectations. What makes Robin Hood such an appealing hero? What has Dorothy learned from her adventures in the Land of Oz? How have the relationships among the leading characters in the Marvel Universe changed over the years, and how have they stayed the same? Readers of both news stories and fictional stories frequently ask, who says? But this question carries very different imports for the two sets of readers, or as we might more accurately say, for the two kinds of readings. Asked of news stories, who says is a question about authority and reliability, a question whose agenda is a yes or no answer to the implied question of whether the speaker or writer can be trusted. Asked of fictional stories, who says has a far more complicated valence. It refers first to the particular circumstances of the fictional speaker, the narrator or implied author, and to the context behind this story. In addition, it refers to the author. Who is the author? And how does the story compare to the author's other work? Finally, it refers to a series of broader contexts. What national, racial, historical, political, economic, cultural, and institutional contexts inform the meaning of this story? Readers who think it's really important that Emily Dickinson never married, or that Charles Dickens novels were serialized in monthly numbers before they were published separately, would love to know more about the life of William Shakespeare, not so that they could debunk his plays as biased, but so that they could root them more firmly in his biography. The questions we routinely ask about fictional stories are occasionally asked about news stories as well. When they are, however, they're most often posed as gotcha questions, as if exposing the bias or agenda, or even the implications behind a given news story automatically discredited the story's truth claims, or its status as news rather than commentary. In fact, an assumption NewsGuard makes explicit about the news is that it's defined, or ought to be defined, in contradistinction to editorial commentary or opinion pieces, even though the implications of news stories, as opposed to the facts they convey, always involve questions of judgment that are at least as important as questions of accuracy. One particularly obvious question that critical readers of fiction often ask, what makes this story a story, is hardly ever asked by even the most skeptical readers of the news. And this question, like all the other questions I've suggested readers commonly ask of fictional stories, is less reductive than the questions, is this news story accurate, or is this news source trustworthy? Because it can't be answered simply yes or no. Answering it inevitably encourages readers to reflect in ways that engage them more actively and critically in the business of reading. Simply put, then, readers of fiction ask a much wider range of questions about what they're reading. The most important questions they ask can't be answered yes or no. They ask these questions without animus, and they consistently act more resourcefully, penetratingly, and critically than readers of the news, even if they're the very same readers. In other words, the difference between better and worse readings of the news isn't reducible to a difference between more and less trustworthy news sources, or even between smarter and dumber readers, but between smarter and dumber ways of reading. When you think about it, this observation, which may at first seem surprising, is thoroughly predictable, because most of us have many different ways of reading, stemming in large part from our different motives for reading. It's obvious that we read or watch advertisements much more skeptically than we read or watch the news broadcasts they punctuate, and that we do so without descending into nihilistic cynicism of a commercial culture. It's almost equally obvious that most of us have long since become comfortable with different ways of reading different sections of the newspaper. When you read the news, you ask how things changed from yesterday. When you read weather reports, you ask, how will this affect me? When you read editorials, you ask, do I agree with this? And maybe what evidence is offered for this? When you read obituaries, you ask, do I know any of these people? When you read the comics, you ask, what's the joke here? And when you read the sports pages, you ask, did my team win? So it's clear that our different motives for reading different kinds of news lead us to raise different questions about it. Though when it comes to what journalists call hard news and what many commentators call real news, we often don't choose to do so, or even notice that we're capable of doing so. More generally, readers approach fiction as a product in at least two senses they don't approach the news. First, they consider it an intentional object whose author deliberately aims to provoke specific reactions. And second, they consider it a product of its times, shaped by national, racial, cultural, economic, historical, and institutional imperatives. By contrast, readers typically discuss news reports as products only to debunk them by emphasizing their artifice and fictionality. Of course, reading fictional stories as intentional objects isn't an innate habit. It's a habit readers commonly learn in school as first-year college students, if not before. But if they can learn to read fiction this way without debunking or denigrating it, surely they can learn to read the news along similar lines, discounting its claims, as Kenneth Burke would say, without losing their respect for it. In addition, readers of fictional stories are more clear-eyed and perceptive about their motives for reading than readers of news stories, who, if you ask them, merely assure you that they're looking to be informed about the world. At the very minimum, readers of fiction acknowledge that they're seeking entertainment from the immediate experience, something news reports ever since the launch of USA Today in 1982 have increasingly sought to provide at the cost of hurting their reputation, and that they're seeking insight or wisdom that goes beyond that immediate experience, a goal to which media literacy has so far been our closest approach. Devoted news readers swear that they're not looking for entertainment or self-affirmation, but I strongly suspect they are, as you can tell from the time they spend clicking on news stories whose facts they're already familiar with, just so that they can nod their heads again. Since media literacy, as NewsGuard's self-presentation suggests, remains limited almost exclusively to questions of accuracy, objectivity, and accountability, it seems both far less reaching and less ambitious than the fictional literacy we labor to teach our students, even if we never point out to them that it has uses that range far beyond their ability to appreciate Cervantes and Yeats and James Patterson. For all these reasons, it doesn't feel like a stretch to suggest that we could profitably incorporate a wider array of habits and questions from our readings of fiction into our readings of the news. Modeling your readings of news stories on your readings of fictional stories encourages you to ask questions like these. What's the leading implication that makes it worth reading? What evidence is offered in support of that implication? What contrary evidence could be offered against that implication? How many different stakeholders this story describes can I identify, and how many of their opinions are represented here? Which opinions and stakeholders have been left out of the story, and why? What does the story assume I already understand and believe, and what is it trying to get me to understand and believe? What makes this story seem more important than other possible stories that could have run instead? How has this story been covered by competing news sources? Whose interests are served by publishing this story and urging me to accept it? What response does the story encourage me to make? And how do I feel about making that response? More generally, reading news stories with the same habits you've sharpened in reading fictional stories encourages you to approach the news mindfully, with a full awareness of the circumstances under which the news is produced that make it take the forms it does, and the ways it seeks to have us respond to it, whether or not we actually do respond that way. Mindful news readers never make the mistake of confusing the news with the facts or the truth. They're constantly aware that news reports are products, researched, reported, edited, and marketed by people whose avowed goal of providing us with all the news that's fit to print is constantly complicated by lots of other decisions that have nothing to do with whether the stories are true. Which stories to pursue, for instance, when they're ready to report, how much prominence to give them, how to convince readers that they're newsworthy and burnish the source's authority, and how to frame them through photographs, headlines, and the selection or omission of particular details. Keeping these variables in mind makes it easier to read the news as the news from this source, or the news as that journalist sees it, or the news according to the right or the left, or the kind of news I'd expect from Fox or MSNBC or The View. Since after all, the main differences between different news sources aren't their factual contradictions, but their selection, emphasis, and framing of the facts. Not the facts they present, but the beliefs they use those facts to encourage. Here I'd remind you of a well-known example from the New York Times. After the August 2019 shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, President Donald Trump traveled to El Paso to speak. The front page Times story about his visit was originally headlined, "Trump urges unity versus racism." But when thousands of early readers protested that this headline was seriously misleading, the Times changed it to "Assailing hate, but not guns." A furious debate, whose parties included the president himself, erupted over which headline was more accurate, which of them was more biased, and what business America's newspaper of record had changing the headline of a lead story that had already appeared online. Without taking sides in this debate, I'd simply point out that it had nothing to do with the facts of Trump's visit, which were reported in the very same words, except for the different headlines that introduced them, and everything to do with how the Times wanted to frame or pitch the story. If you think one of these headlines is slanted and the other one isn't, or that the Times should have found a headline like "President travels to El Paso" that would have presented the story in completely unbiased terms, I'd ask you to recall something that readers of fiction already know, that fiction is always biased, always agenda-driven, and something that news reporters and editors know, that what sells the news is not that it's true, but that it's newsworthy. And questions about what makes it newsworthy, what makes it matter, are always subjective. To summarize the arguments I've been making about the relation between news literacy and fictional literacy, most of us read fictional stories a lot more critically than we read news stories. Asking the same kinds of questions we already ask of fictional stories would make us more critical readers of news stories. News stories are intentional objects or products, not collections of accurate propositions, and should be treated as such. What makes news stories newsworthy is a series of implications that are neither true nor false, but variously arguable. Reading the news more mindfully depends on transcending binaries like true and false, accurate and inaccurate, trustworthy and untrustworthy. And finally, just because news reporting and editing are irreducibly subjective doesn't mean they have no standards. But just as you wouldn't expect to learn all about the standards of fictional stories from a 20-minute presentation, I hope you won't be disappointed to hear that dealing judiciously and comprehensively with the standards of news stories is outside the scope of this talk. So thanks for your attention. Good luck in navigating the newscape, and be assured that I'd love to know your own thoughts on this red-hot subject.